Hello YouTube, and I'm back with another video. And as you can tell from up here, what I have typed in big letters in bold, it is open source versus proprietary software. So in this video I'm going to use two main examples. My open source example is going to be OpenOffice, or I think may have changed it to LibreOffice. I'm not exactly sure. And then our proprietary example is going to be Microsoft Office. And there's a specific reason why I want to talk about it, especially whenever it comes to programming and developing. What are some differences that we see? And it's like my sister recently got a MacBook to use for school, and getting Microsoft Office for the MacBook is like $300, and it's insane, so there's no point in paying for that. But she kind of gets aggravated with open source software, and I'll be honest, sometimes it is aggravating, but there are pros and cons to each of them. So let's look at open source software. Then proprietary. I already spelled it there, and I bet I spelled it wrong. Proprietary. And then do pros, cons. Why did it automatically bold? So, what are some pros of open source software? It's usually free. It's, as said, open sourced, which means the source code is available to anyone. I spelled that wrong too. It is usually a community effort of developers, which in open source software, usually someone starts a project and they make it open source, but in open source software is a community effort to progress the software. It's not really a company that handles the software. It is a community of people. Even if you're not a developer or programmer, you can still submit bugs, you can submit issues, you can submit ideas to the developers of the project. So it is a community effort. So if you see something that OpenOffice needs, you can suggest it. Whereas in Microsoft, I don't know if they allow you to make suggestions like that. Usually on closed source software they don't. But what are some cons? There are cons of open source software, and you know, it sucks, but there are some downfalls. Stable, or sometimes it's not exactly stable. Like sometimes it'll close unexpectedly, or maybe you click on something and something just doesn't seem to work right or work the way you want it to. With OpenOffice, I always seem to have the issue with things being formatted properly and getting things to get formatted, which in Microsoft Office I tend to also, but it's not really that bad. So what are some pros of, just noticed that A was missing there. So what are some pros of proprietary software? It's stable out of box, which is the big thing. That is the key. Usually whenever a company that sells software throws it out into the market for everyone to get, it's usually stable and there's not many issues with it compared to open source. And it's because they're making money off of it. It looks really, really bad on them. Technically, it's supposed to be more secure, but if you know anything about Linux and Windows, you know Windows has had big security issues where Linux really hasn't. So, what are some cons of closed source software? It's not a community effort. The company really doesn't care what you think about the software as long as you're buying it, and it costs money. And the reason why I wanted to do this video is to kind of give you guys the same explanation I was giving my sister, because she gets annoyed using OpenOffice. But I mean, it's free, it's a community effort, even though sometimes it's not exactly stable. And me personally, I always prefer to go with the open source if possible, because throwing light out there on the open source guys. And also a pro of open source that I think is a pro is that they make money based on donations. So you don't have to pay them. If you want to, you can donate, and it's always a good idea to throw those guys a couple bucks. Another pro of proprietary software, there's not really, I forgot to throw free up here. There's not really too many other pros I can think of other than it's stable out of the box and it's supposed to be more secured. Sometimes it's not always true. And the cons of open source, once again, not exactly stable, but the con of proprietary software is that it costs money. For instance, Microsoft Office, I don't know the exact price, but I know to get it on a Mac is like somewhere up in like the 300s, where you can get OpenOffice completely for free. And this does kind of matter with programming. If you have this programming idea, or if you have this idea for a piece of software, and you're like, okay, I'm going to write down this software, and then after you get the software ready, then you're coming to, should I make it proprietary or open source? In the beginning, it might be a good idea to start off with the open source and use that, so that way you can get customer feedback, or you can get feedback from an audience, and then maybe move to being proprietary. But usually that kind of looks bad on an organization if they do that, and there's kind of like some resentment from the people who've used the software when it was open source, and the next thing you know, they have to pay for it. But if you go proprietary, be sure to test all of the bugs in your software and get them fixed. Test them on different machines, test them under every circumstance. Whereas with open source, it's not really a big deal if you throw out a piece of software and one feature in it doesn't exactly work how it's supposed to. Because in open source, the developers get told by the people who use the software and then they fix it. Or, for instance, with the Linux kernel, it's a free. You can actually go to, I believe it's kernel.org, and you can download the Linux kernel. You can submit ideas into the maintainers of Linux, which is Linus Torvalds and some others. But I think that pretty much hits it on the head with the difference between open source and proprietary software.